Hey there, Metatopia. You're here with the panel on creative limits. What walls do you put up so you can bounce off them? And we're here at the 12:30 Eastern time mark. So wherever you are in the world, I think that's like UTC -4 right now. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hope you've grabbed some lunch and drink and you're here with us to talk about this fascinating prospect of limiting yourself so you can actually get work done. My name is Sen-Foong Lim. I'm a designer, developer, and sensitivity cultural consultant from London, Ontario, Canada. I'm probably best known for games like, I don't know, Scooby Doo, Escape from the Haunted Manor, and Avatar, The Last Airbender, Legends, and all that kind of stuff. So, but I'm not the most important person here today. The most important people here today are the panelists. So we're going to start with them. Can I get you to introduce yourself, Mo?
Hey, I'm Mo Poplar, designer of Shibuya Nights and forthcoming Holdfast Station. Um, yeah, I have creative constraints.
There you go. And Paul, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Paul Stefko. I'm a tabletop role-playing game primarily designer and writer. Most recently, I published Crashing Beasts and Crumbling Halls, a fate-based dungeon fantasy game. But I've also done work for Evil Hat, uh, Pelgrane Press, Atlas Games. Yeah.
Cool. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Quinn Murphy.
Hi, Quinn Murphy. I am a tabletop designer. Various things. My one sort of indie game I have out now is Community Radio, sort of like a Night Vale based sort of improv RPG. I also do lots of freelance stuff. I've got out recently published for Paizo in the Strength of Thousands adventure path, spoken on the song Wind, and that adventure, and also part of the I think newly backed just backed Iron Kingdoms game beyond supplement Beyond the Borderlands. I'm writing an adventure for that, and then a bunch of other stuff.
Very cool. I just before we start, I do have to tell you that one of my constraints was not making a game because Quinn Murphy already did it. Uh, Banana Ted and I, we were totally talking about, hey, what if we had this game where, or I was thinking, where you're you're a call-in talk show radio DJ type person, and she said, "Have you ever heard of Quinn Murphy?" So it's like, ah, there's a constraint right there. So today we're here talking about constraints, like limits, boundaries that we set for ourselves or that are put upon us. When we were just kind of in the green room chatting about stuff, Quinn mentioned a couple things like, what does success look like? What does done look like? Mo, can you tell us what constraints you put on yourself? Have you put any on yourself? How did they help you? How did they hinder you?
I think for me, biggest constraints are kind of why I'm making games. I'm
Mm,
making games for the RPG community and for people who maybe aren't traditional to the RPG community. So, um, a lot of my design style really starts with of inviting people in and maybe not leading with crunch. Um, so there is a huge anime kind of zeal in the African American community, and a lot of people want to talk about the anime. A lot of people want to talk about the manga. A lot of people want to talk about the culture, and they have liked my games. So there's a certain point where it's like, how do you invite people who haven't gamed before, who aren't your traditional gaming or audience, into RPGs? And so that means you're leading you're organizing your books, you're designing things in a slightly different way. You're maybe sometimes over explaining things, and it needs to be a lot more readable than a lot of RPG products, in my opinion.
Okay, so one of the constraints that you have is an audience that is maybe not as savvy right out of the gate. So
Right.
you're saying that that has been a not just a limitation, but it directs how you're writing and creating the games that you make, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Quinn, what about you? What's a constraint that you put on yourself that helps you to get the job done?
Now it's interesting. So like I just want to like contrast sort of like I have like two modes. Like I've
Yeah.
got like I'm making my own thing, right, and I'm making something for someone else. So what's lovely about making something for someone else? Why one reason I like freelancing um, is people give you like a word count, and like word counts are these weird things because often when I start a project, I'm looking at uh, like when I was looking at spoken on the song Win, that was like about a 40,000 word count, right? And so I was like, when I start, I'm always like, oh my God, how I don't have 40,000 words. I don't have 40,000 words to say about myself. What am I going to do about like this game? How am I going to write this stuff, right? But always around about like the halfway to three quarters kind of thing, I'm sweating bullets. The other way, I'm like, oh my God, how am I going to do this in only like X amount of words? I'm like like I spend the rest of the time cursing the word count, right? But always that word count is this sort of like it's almost this meditative kind of thing that keeps your sort of focus. Like you have to express yourself succinctly about these, but completely, right? And
Hmm.
sort of that helps sort of it forces you to figure out what's important and what is not, and how to sort of get around that way. Now that's a thing where somebody else provides me the constraint, and thank you. Now for myself, when I'm making something, and this is a thing that I've struggled with, is like it's taking me lots of iterations on things. Um, I find that I'm most successful when I give myself. Um, I don't necessarily need to worry about a word count if I'm doing it myself. Um, but if I give myself like a constraint, like a scope constraint, like or like the stuff that I won't do, right? Like I'm
Hmm.
not going to include these kind of things in my game. I'm not going to make some comprehensive subsystem. I'm going to focus on this one aspect, like completely, and then and then focus towards that, and that will keep me focused because a lot of times for me, the way my mind works, I could just imagine things for days and keep adding and adding and adding, and it will just never get done. But if I tell myself there are a bunch of things that I can't do, um, then it helps me a lot.
Hmm. Now, before we move over to Paul, I don't know why you'd need 40,000 words to tell us about yourself because you just need like what? Like Quinn Murphy is awesome. That's 4 words, dude. That's all you need. You have like a whole bunch of words left over. Paul, how do you use constraints? What is an effective type of constraint for your style of writing and work?
Yeah, I kind of want to piggyback off of what Quinn was saying.
Well, he is awesome, so
The
there you go.
dichotomy of the stuff I'm doing for myself versus the stuff I'm doing freelance for other publishers. The thing that really helps me when I'm working for someone else is that they will give me a deadline. They will say, if you do not have this many words done by this date, we are not going to pay you. And I'm like, oh yes, that is the motivation that I need. Um, for my own projects, I have a very difficult time doing that for myself. But in particular with the my most recent game, Crashing Beasts and Crumbling Halls, I had been working on that for a while, and then there was always something else I could add. It's like, oh, I could have a sample adventure. Oh, I could have a big chapter full of monsters. Oh, I could have all these magic items. And it got to the point where I I just said, you know what? I'm never going to finish this if I keep saying I could just add X. I need to do Y. So it was at a point, I folded in a like one change that was just enough to go, okay, that's the box. It's the box is filled now, and I can put it out there, and somebody else can open it and tell me whether it's any good or not. And then that also opened it up the possibility for me to expand on the game with auxiliary material. I've been doing a monthly zine on my Patreon where I supplement the game with all of that stuff that I said, oh, I could just do X. Oh, I could just do Y. Oh, I could just do a piece of X this month. I could do a piece of Y next month. And so that really helped me sort of plot out a whole string of content.
That's a great way of doing it. So you've basically, given yourself a limit, saying the box is this big. That's all that's going to fit in there. But I have this trail that I can leave breadcrumbs on through Patreon, so that people who liked what I did can come get more every
Mhm.
month.
Exactly.
And then all those ideas that you had, they get turned into breadcrumbs instead of being part of the sandwich, which I think is an awesome way of thinking about it. Because you're right, as creatives, we're almost never done. We almost never feel satisfied with what we've done, and it's like we could design for days, but somebody somewhere is saying ship it. And if we're not uh, you know working for free, as a freelancer or for a publisher that's having that creative control, or at least the project management control, it gets real hard. um, One of the things that I do personally is I create that scope document right from the beginning. It's called a vision document, the way that I do it, and I think about, what is this game trying to evoke? What feelings, what experiences are we going to evoke? And then from there, it's like, does it do that? You know, I also am very much in the mind of thinking about things like products, because that's what happens after 15, 20 years in the industry. Everything becomes a product. And so, what dollar value will this have? What box will this fit in? Who will buy this thing? All become relevant questions in terms of, just like Mo was saying, who's the audience dictates what this thing is going to be. Is it going to be this 30-page rule book, or is it going to be a 5-page rule, or is it going to be a 1-page rule book? All depends on the audience. And that then dictates, a whole bunch of stuff about the game. So I like what you all are saying in terms of the boundaries that you're setting for yourself, or that you have imposed upon you. Um, w- Paul, when has that failed? Has that ever failed for you? Has it been like, this is a fantasy heartbreaker now because I've poured my entire life into it? That ever happened to you?
I have so many projects in various stages of development that I've just let go like on and on and on for so long, that at this point I kind of have had to abandon some of them. Not like abandon, but like be like, I'm not realistically going to have the time or the brain cycles to devote to this in anything approaching the near future. Um, and I'm slowly learning how to accept that. Like, I don't like letting my babies die, basically. You know?
Yeah, who does?
Yeah.
Mhm.
But yeah, they're ideas that I will always have with me, and I can come back to them if I figure out what the box looks like, to go back to that.
Hmm.
You know? So
It's a good analogy, having limits, like the box is this physical limit, and what would go in that box, right? Quinn, when we were in the green room, you were saying that you had a cautionary tale. Is now the
Yeah.
time for that tale?
All right, everybody, sit around the campfire, uh,
Uncle Quinn is
and
about to tell us a
Uncle Uncle
story.
Uncle Quinn's about to tell you a lurid, sordid, no, not sordid, but a scary tale. The tale of Five Fires. So Five Fires is a game that I made. I actually one of my first major play tests was at Metatopia. Shout out to Metatopia.
Oh yeah.
And it was great, and it was like really popular. It was like it was Five Fires is basically an RPG about hip hop, right? And you play like a crew in sort of like sort of like 80s era kind of hip hop, sort of like you make your own city, right? But it's inspired by the way I would the TLDR description, how I think of it is like Beat Street the RPG. um, Beat Street
Beat
is like,
Street, the king of the beat. You see them
yeah,
rocking that beat from across the street. Aha.
I mean, there are other hip hop movies, but for me, like Beat Street is like the
Street was it.
quintessential
Oh,
one.
for sure.
And as a game, it like actually worked pretty well. But then it was like, oh, how do I? There is especially at the time, it might be easier to sort of develop and have more of an audience sort of now. But like about like this is like 8-10 years ago, when I did it. There wasn't like the same kind of audience. There wasn't the same sort of a lot of things for it. And so I was trying to figure out how to sort of do outreach, how to um, make it for the kind of people I wanted black people to play this game. So I wanted to sort of make it accessible to them. How did I sort of communicate this other stuff? How do I do the history? And I just had all of these things that I added and felt like need to be perfect. Because there wasn't like a game like it out, and I felt like all this intense pressure to make it these things, and and I would put it down, and then I would try and pick it back up. Oh, I've got a new idea, and I kept adding things to it and adding things to it, and not just ideas, but pressure, expectation, right? And you were just like, it was just like,
Yeah.
imagine you have this plate, right? And you're at a buffet, but you don't get to control going through the buffet. The buffet is just a conveyor belt, and it puts things on your plate, right? And then when it's done, you're like, you can pick up the plate, but like your plate's like 100 pounds now, right? Like you can't even get it back to your thing. And that's what it ended up being. It was just this pile of stuff, and eventually, I've been designing other things. I've been working on other stuff and trying to come back to this thing, and it became this source of like pain. And I will just say this game, it functionally worked. You can play it. It's pretty good, if I say so myself. And really just needed a bit more polish, but I couldn't even approach it to finish it. So I eventually just kind of like took off the copies of the internet. Like I just put it away. So I could close the loop and move on, and then just sort of take the lessons from it.
It's literally your Moby Dick.
Yeah.
It is your white whale.
Yeah.
And that's too bad because it sounds awesome. Sounds
Yeah.
super, super
I mean,
awesome.
I will do like a sort of a Mark II of that at some point, but it's just like put it to rest for now.
Yeah, I would hope to see it. When you said Five Fires and then it's like, oh, hip hop, and that now it makes total sense. And it's like, oh, okay. Now I want to play this game. I'm a huge hip hop
Mhm.
head, so it's like that is something that I want to see out there. So please, please, please do make that. Put some constraints on yourself before you start, though.
Oh, one thing I
Yeah.
just want to add super quick. When we were talking about like kind of writing out the box and stuff, one thing I really enjoyed about working with Paizo is that when you work with their developers, they basically they don't only hand you a word count. They hand you like a spec, like a kind of like, hey, here's the kind of things we want. We want you to sort of hit these things. It's like a sort of initial outline, and then from there you make an outline with like this, like how you're going to implement it, and then that's sort of your guideline, and then we're like, and I found that process for me to be like deeply focusing. I'm going to actually steal it for my own
Yeah. That's
things.
great.
So
So it's like a
that's it.
workflow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's perfect. Mo, what about you? What do you have any horror stories of when constraints have gone wrong or lack of constraints has gone wrong for you?
Um, I have two. Both of them are really relatively brief. I have a one where it's a topical constraint. I came to Metatopia in 2019 with a Descended from the Queen game called A Bullet in the Blank. You play Western desperados who are having some, you know, uh, frontier therapy at the barrel of a gun, and you
Hmm.
figure out if you're going to walk away and go get a drink or if you're going to shoot each other. And it it generated tons of raucous laughter, and like people were like, I really want to play this at a bar with a cocktail, and talk trash and all this other stuff. And I think at least in the States, we're in a space where I don't know if people really want to talk about a fun game about bullets and blanks. you know, Suddenly, police shootings are in the news, and gun violence is in the news, and a young lady just got killed on a film set, and it's just like every time I think about, well, maybe things have cooled off. It's like America shoots somebody, and it gets in the news, and so it kind of doesn't matter how fun the game is. I don't know how palatable it is to some.
Right.
I also have a kids card game that I'm trying to have it published in the United States. That is, have it manufactured in the United States with cards and a map insert, and that seems to be a very tall order um,
It
to
is in
come by.
America. It really
Right,
is, unfortunately.
and so, it's just really been a question of, do you do those breadcrumbs and drive traffic to your site, let people download it? It's for little kids learning math, and so there's a certain point where, this map's gonna be destroyed anyway, so that that's definitely a thing to do, but, um, that's a technical constraint that I'm trying to get my head around.
That is really interesting. So, working on Avatar Legends, I can tell you that the current state of being in the world, lack of paper is a huge constraint. The shipping constraint is a huge constraint right now. There are companies that can't produce the volume of books that we need for Avatar Legends, um, and America just isn't up to par with China, unfortunately, in terms of manufacturing these types of products. So even at like a higher price point, they're still not going to get the same quality, unfortunately. So those are
Right.
constraints that are very real world constraints that we have to deal with as well. Um, so I'm going to ask you again, Mo. What is your favorite constraint to put on yourself? What is something you start off every project saying this is the constraint that starts it all off? What is that constraint for you?
Um, my favorite constraint is probably just trying to differentiate products in the market. Currently, I'm working on a holdfast station, and there was definitely a question of, well, why does this one more RPG need to exist in the world? you know, and so me and my design partner, Michael Lowe, we decided we're going to make this a zero prep RPG. And so this is a game you can play when that one person didn't show up for your campaign and you want to play something, you could pick this up and have a 3-hour session, and it's amazing. And so that started to beg the question, how do you do that? And do you break the form of the RPG book? Do you tell people to do things in a specific way? Um, Even though some GMs are going to feel talked down to, and other GMs are going to be encouraged to do this maybe for the first time. So just kind of threading this needle of like doing something new and making it work. Um, that those are the ones I like. The ones
Cool.
I don't like are, you know, um, the thing we want to do just doesn't have a profit margin that works.
That is not a fun one. That's not a good constraint. No, you're right.
Mhm.
Quinn, what about you? What's a constraint that you particularly like other than word count?
Well, this is sort of like adjacent to that, but um, it's something I find I need helps me get going on the project is like workflow, right? It's
Yeah.
like I know I'm working on a project when I've like like I have at this point like a real process of how I do things. Like I like sit do free writing, then I like start putting stuff like I open up like a Miro board, I start like throwing up notes, and then start doing writing and like getting like when I'm doing that, I get projects done. When I don't do that, they drift, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I have an automatic word count calculator that keeps me on track. It's like you need to write 1,000 a day, and it counts down, and it's the best thing ever. Because if I didn't have it, I would not know if I did or not, and I wouldn't do it. Paul, what about you? I remember you saying that you like deadlines. What's another constraint that you would automatically want somebody to give you or you would want to put on yourself and sometimes might forget, but you should put on yourself? What's the one that makes you work
Um,
the best?
to be perfectly honest, it's like picking a genre, picking a like the fictional constraints of the design because I come from a background. I'm a people who know me on Twitter and whatnot know I'm a big proponent of generic systems like Fate or like GURPS,
Hmm.
which are these big toolkits and proclaim to be able to do vast numbers of different genres. And it's like, yeah, cool, that's great. Now I have to narrow it down so I know actually what I'm doing with all of that material. Because you can't design for everything, so you have to pick what am I actually designing for? And that's sometimes something that I forget
So
because I love those generic rule sets, those toolboxes so
right.
much. So
And so you're talking about, like, narrowing down the thematic the world that you're building and the themes
yeah,
that you want to talk
is
about and play.
yeah, you have to ask yourself, and I think you mentioned it earlier, having what are the emotional goals of the design? That's sort of a constraint that you put. That's the sort of thing. Like, is this creating what experience am I shooting for? And I can't have everything feed into that, so I have to choose the things that actually do most strongly.
Mhm. And I find that's a really big strength of modern RPGs is that you might be not telling as broad a story as, a rambling 7-year campaign arc, but you're telling a really damn good story about one or two things. And I think the modern RPGs or whatever you want to call them, um, they've really nailed that on the head where you can really pinpoint what is this actually doing? What are we actually talking about? So I have a theory, if you want to hear it. I'll just tell you anyways, of experiential game design. So I think of experiential game design as a house, and the roof is the experience because that's what we see from far away, the roof, and then the walls, the four walls, are made out of your theme and your mechanisms, and the other two walls, because you're saying, Sen, how does a house stay up with just two walls? The other two walls are the theme and the mechanisms talking to each other, so informing each other, and I really find that helps me to constrain my design when I think of, okay, what's the experience? And then I go from there to say, okay, what mechanics resonate with that experience? What theme resonates with that
Mm.
experience? Because it's not always the same thing. And so I use that a lot to help guide me in terms of constraints and play things like that. Paul, have you ever entered a contest, like design contest or anything like that? Something that had a set constraint on it. You're gonna write a one pager about, cats, and then
So yeah, this actually steps a little bit outside of analog game design, but I've actually started learning how to do digital game design.
cool.
I've been learning it's called a fantasy console. It's called Pico 8.
Okay,
Basically, it's a software package that sort of pretends that it was an 8-bit console from the 80s, like an NES or
that's
whatever.
awesome.
So all of your programs have to fit into 32K of memory. You can only use 16 colors at a time. All
Oh
of
my
these
god,
constraints. Yeah.
People
constraints
make
out
great
the
games with it.
wazoo. Yeah.
Yeah, and the very first game I created with it um, was for a game jam where, above and beyond all of the constraints of Pico 8, your program had to fit into 1024 characters in the code editor, and you couldn't use the sprite editor, you couldn't use the sound editor. All you could do was in your code.
That's
And
really super
so
interesting.
I made a snake game just because I knew the premise and the concepts of how to program something like that from years ago.
Yeah.
But I was learning the thing, and I fit it into about 1,000 characters, and it was really satisfying to do that. And there's actually a much more elaborate version of it on my itch page now. But yeah, that was those constraints were so energizing because it's just like, how do I it's like, okay, I do all this stuff. Oh crap, I'm like 20% over my over my limit. How do I pare this down? And that's not even like, there are people that will fit entire Pico 8 games into tweets. Like,
Wow.
the optimization for these, but like finding ways to like pare down and pare down and pare down. I think that's a lesson that can even be brought back into an analog design as
Oh,
well.
100%. Like when you said, nobody likes to kill their babies, that is probably one of the number one pieces of advice that I give people. It's like you might need to, cut some stuff out before you add stuff back. We're really good at additive synthesis. We're really bad at subtractive synthesis, right? So that whole Pico 8 thing sounds ridiculously amazing because um, when you can make something out of all those constraints, that says something about your chops as a designer, right? When you have the world open to you and you have every single resource, you know, almost overwhelming, right? It's like this big dark nothing. But when you get this constraint, sometimes it's comforting. What about you, Quinn? Have you ever done a contest before?
I have not done a contest, but like a similar sort of constraint thing that I did was I have a game called It Wants Souls in the Ultimate Micro RPG book out, and it's like a horror game. And so doing that thing is like, I've not done a RPG that small before ever.
Right.
And then for like a horror genre thing, it's there to symbolize that sort of classic horror thing of like a family moves into a house and there's some entity who wants to devour their souls or whatever. And I found that similar to sort of what Paul was talking about, trying to evoke and going to that sort of evoking an emotion. They're trying to do that in such a small footprint. It was super hard. It
Mm.
took me like a while. Like I spent a lot of time thinking, trying to find what that way to kind of evoke this sort of thing, trying to uh, have an incursion into the lives of these people. And then but it was interesting because once I found it, um, it was like the rest was very easy to write. Right, like it was like okay, wrote it really quickly. But like I spent most of my time like searching for it, and it ended up being like a thing of communication, of like basically to symbolize that sort of outside influencer during certain scenes, during certain parts of it. They are literally not allowed to speak to the other players, so they're like the demon watching.
Ooh.
And then only when the demon's going to like attack is it allowed to speak to any of the other players during the game, right? But that took like for because it's so against the rules
Yeah.
of RPGs that it took forever for me to find. So it was like I was thankful for that constraint of
Yeah.
words because I never would have gotten it otherwise.
Yeah, it's so interesting how constraints can actually bring out the best in us as designers.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, like, there's a big thing or it's actually a small thing in board gaming. It's like mint tin games. So how can you fit a whole game in a mint tin, like an Altoids tin?
Mm.
And like everybody's like, oh, what if I could? And how would I do that in a mint tin? So constraints really do bring out the best in some designers. Mo, what about you? Have you ever done any contests or something similar to that? We had an
Um,
constraint put on
a-
you?
as as a dad who's trying to stay married with a day job, I I can't
That's
go for
great.
all the bait that
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
our game jams. But my design partner, Michael Lowe, he designed a game Zero Samurai, which is
Mhm.
kind of the conceit of Seven Samurai. But if
So 7 less, yeah.
no samurai show up to help the village, you play the villagers who are
Oh, that's awesome.
Hmm.
using non necessarily uh, petty skills to kind of survive the bandits.
Right.
And
Mm.
you know, kind of working on that was like really interesting. And he wrote and designed the game. It's a beautifully written game. It's almost got this narrative quality because his grandfather-in-law actually worked with Kurosawa on a bunch of his
Mm,
films.
Mm.
So it's this real cool conversation between the generations and like how like their screenwriting process applies to RPGs and the collaborative process of storytelling. Um, but I help with some of the mechanics.
That's very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
So, you know what? I think we might be ready for questions from the audience, if there are any.
Let's do it.
Lucas! We're calling Lucas in. Are there any
Whoa.
questions?
Not
Hey.
anything specific at the moment, but I can definitely send some to you if needed.
Okay.
Sure.
There definitely is more talking about how the model you were talking before Zen and the use of genre as a constraint, especially in combination
Mm.
multiple genres. More just discussion about that.
Sure. Well, we can talk about that. Why don't we talk about that panel? So, in terms of genre as a constraint, so I'm going to pick on each of you because the genres are apparent for some things. So, I'm going to go to Quinn because, so in the genre of hip hop as a genre, I don't think that's really been done before in any big thing that I know of. But how does the genre of hip hop add a constraint to the game's design mechanically, thematically? product, audience, all those things. What do you think?
Well, I mean, well, yeah, it's interesting because like when we talk about sort of genre as a constraint, there's like I feel like even more aspects of that constraint, like there's sort of like uh, sort of facets to it, and one of them is um, expectation. Right
Mm,
when I get when I'm doing some when I'm engaging in some sort of genre, the medium of it, I expect certain things, right?
yes.
I expect different things from fantasy than I expect from sci-fi, than I expect from hip hop or any of these other things. And so, like for me, I like to look at the expectations for first, whether I'm going to follow them or defy them or whatever I'm going to do with it. And it's very interesting because a lot of times when you say to the like for a hip hop RPG, you're like, oh, it's a hip hop RPG, and people, it's funny because a lot of people, not usually people very actively involved in the genre, expect kind of a focus on topic matter, right? Of like, oh, it'll be like there'll be crime, and it'll be tough, and it'll be this other kind of like I'm just gonna leave that where it is. But for me, um, I think when I think of hip hop, what I think of it, my expectation, I think most people who are like really into it see it have this expectation of expression, right? It is I don't really think arguably like the most kind of like lyrically dominant form of like music that is, and it's so much of it is about people saying like their life experiences, where they
Hmm.
stand, who they are, right? It's language of sort of people not normally given a voice to expressing themselves, forcefully, rhythmically, powerfully, however they feel like. And so for me, when I try and work with something based on hip hop, I first look at how is it a vehicle of expression, right? So like in the Five Fire game, whilst people are like, oh, you should have like these things, like, nope, I don't want any of that. I actually don't deal with any of those topics. Um, Without like getting sort of too deep into it, but like the core mechanic of the game was how you take stress, like you live like your kind of character's life, you deal with their problems, and
Hmm.
then you accumulate stress, and then by expressing the stress in like different art forms like hip hop or breakdancing or other stuff, like they're kind of a mechanic for expressing these things, and
Yeah,
then you get rid of the stress.
it's
So
brilliant. Yeah, so you're not only meeting some expectations, you're probably also subverting some expectations at the same
right.
time, which is
Mhm.
very cool. Mo, what about you? In let's say the pistol game, the bullet at a blank game, what kind of expectations are there from that thematic genre of Western?
It's really funny because I noticed one of the weaknesses of the game was that there is almost a generational divide where some people actually know what a Western is and some people don't. In that descended from the Queen kind of way, the cards generate who your character is as you draw cards and answer questions.
Yes.
And um, I definitely ran into some millennials who, um, didn't know why they were mad at you about what happened in Dodge City. And it seemed that there was almost a scale where like the older you were, the more you were just familiar with the tropes
Yeah,
of
those
the
cultural
Western.
touchstones, right?
Right. And so I had to do some scaffolding to get people up, and the first couple attempts at that were kind of inelegant. It's like, okay, we're going to have a card along with the X card on the table. Here's a card that reminds you that horse thieving and home wrecking are topics you may want to indulge in. And yeah, I think kind of my biggest personal constraint is probably engaging in games that are kind of non-colonialist. I like
Hmm.
games that where you lean into the place that you are, as opposed to going out to conquer another place. And I didn't know that until I listened to a Metatopia panel and like gained, you know, language to even talk about this thing. But you know,
Right?
I'm so much more interested in home, and you know, a lot of people have said of my games, you know, the idea that you know PvP is problematic because you need each other. They thought that was suddenly a innovative you know thing in RPGs, and I'm like, oh, sorry that you think this is new.
Huh. Paul, what about you? So your game Crashing Beasts and Crumbling Halls is very much like a dungeon crawler.
Mhm.
So how do you use the thematic resonance and the constraints that are inherent of, oh, it's just another D&D thing, but it's not, right? So how do you subvert that? How do you change that? How do you break those molds when the constraint seems to already prejudge what this game is going to be?
Um, with that design, a lot of the power to subvert and bend those expectations, I think, comes from I'm using the Fate system, specifically
Mhm.
the Fate condensed most recent iteration of it. So like you have things like aspects. Your characters have these traits that define them, but so does the dungeon. So does the campaign. So like you can set at the big you go into a dungeon, and it's going to have these overarching themes that are encapsulated in its aspects, that can be compelled against the players to create complications for them based on what the dungeon is trying to say, essentially. Um, and in addition, so dungeon fantasy is often very focused on acquiring things, on getting more
Mhm.
gear, on getting better stuff. And that's in there. Every character has, one of their stunts is a piece of gear that's important to them. But you don't track money. You get what are called wealth boosts when you get a big load of treasure. We don't care what it is. You just say you've got a pool of wealth boosts that you can spend like fate points to
Right.
do things, and it's just because you got cool stuff. Tell me what the cool stuff is when you tell me how you're using the boost. So
Oh, cool. So
yeah.
there's less of the, you know, pointless tracking of encumbrance. Encumbrance is one of my most hated mechanics in D&D. And then all counting the gold down to electrum and silver and copper, also
Yeah.
not fun. So you've taken a lot of that stuff out by kind of, no, granularizing, is that even a word? The money systems, and then
Abstracting it,
yeah,
yeah.
abstracting, yeah.
um
Because maybe your game talks about something else other than that, right?
yeah. I wanted to actually speak on again. Quinn said, the expectations of the genre.
Sure.
One of my designs. It's a game called Return True, and it's a game where you're playing people in a near future where technology lets the people in charge essentially edit what you physically perceive about the world around you. They're So everyone has augmented reality. So you're wearing video glasses and you've got earbuds in, and
That's messed up.
the
Wow.
search engines can actually say, "Oh, yeah, uh, this speech is blocked. You simply can't hear it. That person didn't pay their subscription. You can't see them. And we will
Oh,
give you subconscious cues that guide you around them so you don't accidentally bump into someone you can't see."
Oh my god!
wow.
I just have to interrupt for a second. Google, you didn't hear that. Okay.
Yeah. But if you hear that, what genre would you say that is?
Cyberpunk?
I
Yeah.
w- I absolutely refuse to use the word cyberpunk to describe this game because
Good.
everyone has an idea of what cyberpunk is, and
Yes.
almost none of them match what my idea of this game is. So
Yeah.
I don't want to hang that baggage on it. So that I think picking a genre brings a lot of expectations with it. So
Yeah, like
I
you were saying, you want to figure out the fiction, right,
Mhm.
to drive the rest of the game. Very, very important. Um, Lucas, is
We
there
have a
anything else
few
people are
more
discussing?
questions.
Yeah,
Yep.
go ahead.
Yeah, we have one just asking about baseline. How do you generate or discover novel constraints? You know, that ones that aren't used before, that are non-traditional in some way or another. I know
Mm.
you've discussed
Cool.
before, but
Mhm.
specifically on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So, Mo, is there any non-traditional constraint that you can think of that you use or that you think is really creative and fun?
Again, trying to create. Right now, I'm just neck deep in games that are easy to GM, that don't require prep, that the players show up and uh, kind of use like a question answer model to, like, we're going to develop the world here at the table. We're going to play a game, and players are going to engage with the world building and kind of handle some of the GMing too.
Yeah.
Um, I think when you say, let's create a game that doesn't require prep, it just really um, start stretching the imagination. It's like,
Oh, yeah.
what are we going to have in this game? It helps you. I mean, essentially, it's almost bringing lines and veils into the game to a certain extent.
Without
Um,
calling them lines and veils. Yeah.
without calling them, well, and mechanizing lines and veils to actually be part of the game.
Mhm.
Um, and so, doing that in a way, and also kind of using like clocks to kind of like wrap it up, make it neat, and make it a satisfying, gaming experience. Um, but when you say that, all right, um, you're assuming a certain burden, and then you're just you try to find your way out of this painted corner, as it were.
Hmm.
Mhm.
So one of my favorite constraints is I like games where people make things that they
Mm,
then have and can look at and remember the game by. Anything from like a really nice player sheet to a map they drew to the one that's currently on Kickstarter for us, which is an
Nice.
exquisite crime, which is a drawing one where you draw uh, things that you fold out because it's like we'll all contribute to the drawing, and that's one of the characters in the story now. And I had friends who played this with us, and they keep their drawings by their desk so they can just look at them and remember the good time they had, right? And that's what I want to do, is like mementos and tokens and keepsakes in my games. So that is one fun constraint that is kind of novel. I think myself and Banana do it. Gion Shim does it. Shinkor does it. So there's a couple of us who are really into that crafting stuff.
Mhm.
We like paper crafts. We like all sorts of stuff. So there you go. What about you, Quinn? What's something that you think is really an interesting and
Mhm.
fun novel constraint that you've maybe
Mhm.
never seen before?
Yeah. So I think I just want to talk briefly on just like sort of like finding kind of like those non-traditional sort of constraints. A process I like to use, like obviously like research, right? Like if you like if you're like looking to innovate, like definitely read a bunch of stuff, right? And but then also for myself, I do like I have a whole like a pre-design process where I like generate a bunch of stuff and then start like asking questions and sort of interrogating. It's like, what if, like, like, oh, that's neat, but what if I did this but didn't do this, right? Like, and start
Yeah.
sort of posing that. That's a good way to, because like when I was talking about the it wants souls, right? That's sort of basically the process I used to like come up with that not talking kind of thing. And for me, my favorite kind of a lot of places where I come up with um sort of what would be sort of non-traditional constraints is by looking at RPGs as a conversational medium, right? Is that like, because RPGs are conversations, right?
Yep.
They're most of our rules and stuff are for how we talk, right? And what we talk about. And so one way that you can really get to the heart of affecting the experience is to change how is to give instructions on how to talk, right? Or how, or what not to say, or what to say, or when to say it, right?
Mm.
You can alter by altering the conversation in this way, you alter the inherent nature of playing the game, which is again one of the things that I love about RPGs. Like, you can change how you think, you can change how you talk, and you change the game. Like, I can talk about God of War however much I want, but like, it is still the game, and I can think about it however I want, but it is still what they produced, right? But
Yeah.
like any other games that we like, RPGs that we play, those things will actually change the result, and that's awesome.
Hmm. Yeah. What about you, Paul? What's one of your favorite novel, interesting types of constraints that you don't think people use much?
Uh, well, I wouldn't say that people don't use it much. I think so. I think there are many people that what I like to look at is what you mentioned mint tin
Yeah.
games earlier. I love looking at the way people use the components of a game in novel ways. Um, I think people can get too complacent. It's like, oh, okay, we're gonna have dice. You're gonna roll 2d6, or you're gonna roll, a handful of d10s or whatever. Um, I love novel resolution mechanics. I love novel ways to manipulate objects. It's like, what happens if you have a bunch of dice, and they're, some of them are different colors, and you put them in a bag, and you pull random colors out, and the colors mean different things, and
Mm-hmm.
you have to assign them to different boxes on your character sheet depending on how you want the action to resolve, and all of those things just fascinate me. And I think there are people out there doing those kinds of experiments with things. It's like, oh, okay, how does the game play differently if you've got standard poker sized card versus you have the more room of a tarot sized card, or all of these things. Like, and sometimes I worry that these things that I love are too uh they're too reliant on being in a physical space with one another. Like, the pandemic has really made
Yeah.
everyone step back and go, wait a minute, people can't always be together. What if, how do we translate this? How do we do interesting things digitally as well? Quinn looked like he
Can
had a
can
comment.
Oh, digital has been like you just brought up, like digital online has actually been a very interesting constraint
Constraint.
that people have been
Yes.
doing interesting things with.
Yeah.
It's why Alice is Missing did so well in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, right? Alice is
Mhm.
Missing is a phenomenal game, Spencer Stark, that requires you just to text. Like, you're not talking to the people that you're playing with, and it's
Mhm.
perfect for apparently this world we
Well,
currently live in.
right, and it uses
hey
a digital, and the conversational
Uh,
constraints.
hey
Sorry,
Paul.
sorry, no, you're jumping
yeah, go ahead.
So how do you feel about designing a game that requires 10 D10s that are 5 different colors, and um, giving someone a PDF or a hardcover book and saying, um, these dice are required? Like,
Yeah,
this has always
that's
been a challenge of mine.
absolutely. Um, it's one of those things. It's like, why do so many games use D6s? It's because everybody's mom had Yahtzee in the closet.
Mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
Like, it's a hard nut to crack. And like, I would love to be able to say, oh, we should all just be able to make box sets that have the dice in them that people can buy affordably, but that's absolutely not possible these days.
I know
Right, right.
box sets are real expensive, so
Yeah.
they're
in.
nice, they're fancy, but they're expensive.
But
One last quick
Yeah,
question from chat
yeah,
before I think we'll have to wrap up. We have about 6 minutes
sure.
left. So one, just asking, have any of you had constraints changed on you while in a project, or changed your own constraints in the midst of a project, and how did it affect design and release of that project?
So I'll start with this one just because. Uh, so Kickstarter creep is a thing. Oftentimes we'll have designed the full game, presented it to the publisher. The publisher, signs it, and we go. And then they go to Kickstarter, and they add stretch goals. The stretch goals have not necessarily been designed, because who knows if they're going to get made. But then you have the super exciting, wonderfully funded Kickstarter. You're making like 6 figures, sometimes even 7 figures on your Kickstarters, and all of a sudden you have to develop all this content because there are now new constraints, and each of those backers becomes a constraint in themselves. If you've ever run a Kickstarter, you know what I'm talking about. What about you, Mo? Let's start with you. What is a constraint that may have changed in the midst of your design?
I kind of have the fortune of designing for myself. I unfortunately haven't been hired to do games like some of you. And so for me, it just has come down to page count. Your Kickstarter raised X amount of money, and that's how much money you got to spend. And that's just really the brass tacks of it. Um, I haven't I've only developed a couple games, so I haven't stumbled into this yet. And I'm not cavalier enough to show up uh, saying I have something that I want to write, which will then in turn, affected by future shipping costs,
Right.
etc. So, my big thing was I wanted to add custom dice to my Shibuya Nights game. I went and got custom dice made, and then I found out that if you ship a book, it's book rate. If you ship a book with dice, it's box rate.
Yeah. Yep.
And so, you
Yeah,
know,
those kind of things can make or break a company. Like literally, you could go out of business because you were too successful and your shipping cost too much.
exactly.
Yeah. Paul, what about you? What's has anything shifted on you? A constraint that was placed on you at the last minute or anything like that?
Um, I so a few years ago, I was uh, I joined a team. Atlas Games publishes a role playing game called Feng Shui, which is a Hong Kong action movie, zany time travel, cyborg apes, all this stuff,
It's
and
everything.
it's everything to everyone. We hope, but I was brought on to contribute to a collection of adventures, and it was going to be like a color hardcover, and there was going to be Kickstarter and all of this stuff, um and the realities of the timelines shifted, and then the format shifted, and eventually one my contribution was split out into its as just a standalone book, and now they're doing a subscription model where every quarter they release another one. So mine came out over the summer, and it's gorgeous, but it started out as a section of a book, and there was going to be a whole team, and there was the possibility that we would collaborate with one another, or whatever, and eventually it became a standalone thing. And I'm very happy with how it turned out, but it was not. Does not look like what it was originally supposed to look like at all.
So,
Yeah.
did it make more work for you?
It so it not more work. The work was different.
Okay.
It ended up, the revision process ended up looking different. I'd say, much of my work was actually my original draft was actually done while it was still going to be a hardcover. And then waiting for the revisions during that whole period was when the formatting shifts. So it needed to have some more. It needed to have pieces that hung on their own more.
Right, I get it. Because it wasn't part of a thing.
Yeah.
Last but not least, Quinn, can we
Yeah.
get an
Yeah.
idea?
Yeah, I'll make this brief because we're running out of time here. Mine is like a little bit of a project where I put these constraints on myself to help me get it done. Was on the spoken on the song "Wind" thing. So like at about 40,000 words, like the scope of a project, at least for me, like changes. Right, like I'd done about like I think the biggest thing I'd done was about 20,000 words, and about like 5-10,000 words you can kind of hold it in your head and sort of work on a thing. Then at about like 20, you're like, okay, I should structure this a little bit more. And about 40, like you really like need something substantial, and you need like not only like the outline, but you need sort of a process for working, right? And so like I had to sort of put these sort of blinders on myself. It's like, okay, I'm going to work on mechanics at early in the day. I'm going to, and then I will write like more narrative text at night, and sort of like I had to sort of like develop mid project these things to get it in on time, and like thankfully it worked. But like I was sort of constructing the scaffolding and the constraints as I went. It was fun.
Very cool. Well, that's it for today's topic of creative limitations. Quickly, where can we find you, Mo?
You can find me at ashyfeet.com. You can join the Discord for Holdfast Station and get a playtest of the game. You can find um, Zero Samurai on Itch and Shibuya Nights at Drive-Thru RPG.
Great. Paul, where can we find you?
I am at Paul Stefko on Twitter, patreon.com/Paul Stefko for my content. My site is nothingventuredgames.com, and my itch is nvg.itch.io.
Great. And Quinn?
QH_Murphy on Twitter. I've got a bunch of stuff that I've been writing for Paizo lately. And most recently spoken on the song Wind. And thoughtcrimegames.net is my site.
Excellent. And I'm Sen-Foong Lim at Sen-Foong Lim on Twitter. See y'all later. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.